Hey, Spencer. Hi, this is another Crosstalk podcast brought to you by MK Connect. We are under Compass Ministries. However, the ideas and opinions expressed here are independent of Compass Ministries. I'm Rebecca Nettles. I'm happy to be here. And we have with us Michele Phoenix, who's going to be sharing with us a little bit about sharing our MK stories. So, hi, Michele. Thanks for being
Hi.
here.
After that introduction, I feel like I need to say something really controversial that doesn't align with your
Ooh,
ministries.
rebel, rebel. So how about you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself, like the joke of where are you from and what are you doing
Yes.
now?
The painful, gut-wrenching joke of where are you from? Um, uh, well, it's complicated, but not complicated because the people listening to this know what this is like. So I have 3 passports. This is my claim to fame in TCK circles. My father was Canadian, my mom is American, and I was born and raised in France. So I've got all 3 of those passports. I grew up just north of Paris in horse country. It was small town, kind of distant suburban at the time. Now it's really been roped into or wrapped into Paris suburbs per se. But I grew up in a castle. My parents taught at the European Bible Institute, which was housed in a, I think, 18th century castle.
Wow.
So I got to, this little creative, romantic, to my detriment, little girl got to grow up in a castle, wearing my little princess crowns and playing even on the grounds of the castle outside, which also were historic with old stables out there and everything. So I grew up there. Then in 9th grade, I went to Black Forest Academy in Germany, a school for MKs. Somebody listening in today, Crystal, is a former student of mine from Black Forest Academy. It's at BFA that the term TCK wasn't really mainstream yet. Dave Pollock, I remember speaking at BFA when I was a student. And he might have used the term TCK, but it just wasn't common yet. But stepping on campus for the first day in 9th grade and starting to exchange just greetings with others, like, where are you from? I realized that there's an awful lot that makes us similar, even when our particular assortment of cultures might be different from one to the other. So BFA was a mixed bag in 9th grade because I was boarding in 9th grade, and I'm just not built for boarding. That's just not my preferred way to live. But then my parents moved out in 10th grade, and I got to live at home in France, of course, and drive across the border every day for my parents to teach at BFA. Graduated from there. Anybody listening to this who's graduated from boarding school knows that it feels like a death in the family. So we did a lot of mourning in the weeks and months leading up to it. And then we kept on mourning in the weeks and months after graduation, which I like the statement that your grief is the measure of your love. And I think the amount of mourning that goes on in these contexts, along with the celebrating, is a testament to that kind of grief. The other more recent quote is, what is grief if not love persevering? And I love how that also expresses some of what I experienced at that graduation time. That's from a Marvel series. For those of you who don't know, that is one of my mild obsessions, is Marvel movies. So I graduated from BFA, went to Wheaton College. The irony is that I am now sitting today about 10 minutes from Wheaton College in a little town next door to it. And my experience at Wheaton in those days was horrendous, mostly because of what I brought to the equation, because I didn't want to be there. I had picked it because it was the prettiest picture on the 2 college catalogs we had in the library at my school. This was pre-internet. And I came into my college experience expecting everybody to live down to my expectations. And I think when we do that, we tend to cut ourselves off. So I got an education, communications degree. I met a few people. I had my own room. As soon as I could get my own room, I did, because I came into the experience with such a chip on my shoulder. prejudging everybody and every circumstance before I even got there, which is why today I do a lot of speaking on transition, particularly pre-transition. Graduated from there, got my dream job. I had majored in writing in that form of communication, and a company in the area was hiring people to write discussion starters for youth groups in the style of the old movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which in those days was not an old movie. It was a very hip and current movie. So for a year, I got to write really weird discussion starters. And then they ran out of money. They told me either that or they fired me. It was one of those two things. And got a cheap ticket back to visit my parents, who were still teaching at BFA. Ran into my principal while I was over there, and he said, well, why don't you come over and teach at BFA since you're currently unemployed? And I said, sure, I can do that for a year. So I raised 31% of my support and got on a plane ridiculously and moved to Germany, knowing that I could live with my parents as an adult, not recommended, and that would save me some money. And I ended up staying for 20 years. So 1 year at a time, I kept, upping up my commitment to BFA, and truly the highlights of my life. I got to teach, it's a missionary boarding school. So basically your qualifications is having a pulse, and then whatever they need, they'll put you into for that year. So I did have a pulse. So initially I started teaching English and French, but then I got to settle into the sweet spot of drama and creative writing and directing choirs and school plays. And big outreach events, and I loved it. And Crystal, who is on this call, was one of my creative writing students, and I can't believe we're still face to face after all of these years. And then in 2008, it's a long story. I'm going to give you a really condensed version. I got diagnosed with cancer for the first time. And as a result of coming face to face with my mortality, I started to think in terms of what do I want to do with the rest of my life if I only have 1 or 2 years left. And I was so happy and content at BFA. I also got to help out in the dorms at BFA and just do all the fun stuff. But because I wasn't sure how long I was going to have left on this earth, I made the really hard decision to drag up my roots from German soil and expand my ministry into what it is today. And the irony is that the most convenient place for me to live for a global ministry was back in Wheaton. So I'm back in Wheaton. I have discovered that these people are not at all what I expected them to be when I first came back, or what I judged them to be when I first came back. And I've been here now for 10 years. And I do a lot of writing on MK topics and consulting and pre-field orientations and post-field debriefs, and speak with teachers of MKs and MKs themselves and missionary families around the world who need a listening ear and somebody to point them in the right direction. So in a nutshell, that's what brings me here today.
Awesome. And yeah, like a lot of us have read your pieces, your articles, and we love it. Like that's how I first learned about you, was through your articles, and I was like, oh wow, this is perfect. So along the note of writing, where do you have a specific memory of when your passion for writing started?
As soon as I knew how to write, I was writing. I was spinning tales before that, verbally in my mind. The story I like to tell, I was so born and raised in France, right? Fatalistic society. If you watched French movies, listen to French music, you know that it does not end well for anybody. So when I was at this Bible school, the adult students and my mom started a poets corner. So we would all sit around and read poetry to each other. And I think I was 10 or 11 at the time. And I read my first poem to these very beautiful people who had just read poetry about God and nature and love. And here comes little 10-year-old Michele reading a poem about a baby seal being bludgeoned to death. So that was that was the way I introduced myself as a writer to these people. So it's been something I've loved doing from my earliest age. It started out, I think, as self-therapy, and then it merged into or became what it is today, which is hopefully not as much about baby seals and blood and snow.
The poor seal. Well, you've clearly you've done great.
Yeah, evolution, growth, maturity is a really good thing.
It is. How, so you know, have just shared a condensed version of your story. I know you share your story in a lot of other places. how did you learn to share your story? Was that always easy for you, or did that take a lot of time and development for you to actually just share your MK story?
Yeah. Sharing it honestly and in an embodied way was more difficult for me. So sharing it as Michele Phoenix, this is my story, took me a long time to be able to do because, and I do speak on this a lot, because of the shoulds that a lot of MKs and TCKs grow up with. So living in the world of ministry, it's not necessarily overtly said to us, but we grow up with this impression that we need to be very careful about the image that we show to people and the truths that we reveal to people. So I grew up in a complicated household where there was a lot of dysfunction between my parents and us, the kids. And we were also very good at projecting the perfect missionary family when we needed to. So I grew up with this confusion about what part of my reality was okay for other people to hear about and learn about, and what part was something that we needed to keep behind closed doors. So there were many times in my growing up years where I alluded to some of what was happening, even in my own life. I'm also, and I'm very open about this, and trigger warning, but I'm the victim of several forms of abuse growing up as well. And so what am I allowed to talk about and what am I not allowed to talk about? And sometimes I would hint at things that were part of my personal history, and either sense that I was being shushed, like this is not something that we say out loud, or it was being minimized in the ears of those who were hearing it, maybe because I wasn't using strong enough words, because when we live under shoulds, we're not given strong enough words to speak of some of these things. So in that sense, I had to grow into the courage of speaking honestly of the stuff I loved and of the stuff that was really hard. Because even the stuff we love as TCKs, sometimes we feel like we're not supposed to brag about it. When it's not bragging, it's reporting what our life really is. We did get cheap tickets to Monaco for a weekend. That's not bragging, that's actual fact, right? So it can be complicated in that way too. And I so loved being an MK. And I realized early on that people who are not aren't going to understand the gut level experience of being an MK. So even if I used my best words to try to describe it, sometimes they just didn't get it. And that's where actually fiction comes in. So writing fiction has been a part of my life just for the last maybe 15 years now. And I've got 5 books in print by 2 different publishers, by Tyndale and HarperCollins. And fiction actually allows me to embody my story in somebody else's body and to tell parts of what I've been through in a fictional way where, number one, it feels less risky on a personal level. And number two, people are more willing to consider it and enter into it if it's a fictional character and not somebody sitting across the table from them. So, so that's a long answer to a simple question. That on a personal level, it has been a growth area for me to be able to tell my story. I clearly tell it very easily today. And on a fiction level, it's actually like a Trojan horse to expressing who you are and what some of your traumas and joys and victories have been in a way that other people will more easily accept.
That's really cool. That's a great way of putting it. Were you always a fan of public speaking?
No. Oh my goodness, no. No, I studied communications writing, not communications speaking. I had to take a few classes, of course, to get my degree. But for most of my adult years, if I knew that I was going to have to speak the next day, I wouldn't sleep the night before. I mean,
Oh,
sick to my
wow.
stomach, shaky, kind of this real gut level, visceral response to public speaking. So no, that I'm doing so much of it today is a surprise as much to me as to anybody who knew me as a child. This was not the
Oh,
course my life was supposed to take. And yet, here I am.
here you are. Um, may I ask a little tangent question? So
Yes.
with public speaking, so how did you get the courage to do public speaking? Was it just practice, like you did so many times you got toughened up to it, or was there a moment when something switched?
And FYI, there's no such thing as a tangent in my world, so keep them coming. Teaching was helpful. So it's not a performance kind of public speaking, but it makes you real comfortable standing at the front of a classroom or any room and speaking to people. So that was helpful. That was kind of steps towards what I do today. And then passion. When I moved into this aspect of my job, I am so passionate about what I'm trying to convey and about the importance of people understanding the stuff that I try to convey to them, that I think that passion yields courage that overrides long-held reticence. And that really, my ease with public speaking is probably dates back to just these last 10 years when I stepped into this new kind of mission ministry. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks for sharing. What do you believe are some of the biggest ways MKs are benefited by sharing their own story?
Oh my goodness, it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to wrap my mind around it and then my words around it. Telling our own story is like carving into stone, in that it gives it substance and reality. So until I started telling my story, there were aspects of my story, of my history, that felt like they were kind of floating out there. And there were times when they would float into focus and then float out again. And the act of organizing story into words and saying it to somebody else cements it. It's like writing it in stone. It cements our history in other people's minds as well as our own. So it also gives us a sense of legacy, that my story, when I tell it, might be useful to other people who hear it. Not only makes it a measurable thing, but then also gives it the opportunity of having an impact on others. For some MKs, and I see this a lot for those who have just come back to college or just come back to their passport culture for whatever reason it is, and people aren't asking them about what their life has been like prior to this transition. And it feels like they are drifting farther and farther away of that person they were in another context. I felt like the girl who was at BFA, the girl who grew up in France, was becoming less and less accessible to me as I lived in a monocultural setting where I didn't get to tell my story. And it was almost like a sense of losing pieces of myself over time. So when MKs get to tell their story, it's as if all these drifting parts of us are surrounding us like this cloud. And as we tell our story, it coalesces, it all comes back into something embodied. Once again, there's that word, where all of these pieces that have been maybe vague or felt inaccessible come back and anchor themselves back to us. The risk of that in contexts like college, or in contexts where there might not be an interest or an appetite in hearing this kind of story, the risk is that people will hear it and not respond in the way that we want them to. Mm-hmm. So it's been a practice of mine, even with this transition back. So I'm 53 today. I was 42 when I came back from Europe. And I made sure that I would tell the innocuous pieces of my story at cocktail hour, as if I do cocktail hour, just hanging out around in church lobbies. Is that more appropriate? With people that I would cross paths with. I had those standard stories that I could tell that they could relate to. And then the really important TCK stories of mine, I made sure that I knew a person well enough to know that that story would be safe with them before putting it out there. So that as these pieces of myself are coalescing and anchoring back to my identity, I don't run the risk of somebody just kind of brushing them off as unimportant. So having those two sets of stories has been really useful for me. And some TCKs are shy. I know it doesn't sound like it. I am pathologically shy. I'm an introvert. I freak out when I have to just casually enter a gathering where I don't know anybody. Having a purpose helps. So that's why I'm sounding a little bit less introverted right now. But even the introverts can have one or two stories kind of loaded so that if they get asked a question, they have words to put to it. And And even if the story isn't the first thing that other people ask of us, I encourage introverts to sit in public spaces as much as they can. We now have cell phones that we can look like we're there for a reason and busy ourselves on, so we're not sitting on a chair looking around hoping somebody notices us. But if we put ourselves in public spaces and somebody starts a conversation with us, and as those conversations progress, if we have one or two stories that people do relate to, even from a movie, that's an inroad into being able to tell the rest of our life stories down the road as we grow in trust with other people.
Okay, that's great. And for you, like, I mean, I have heard that from a lot of MKs. I've had the experience myself where we feel like we're two people and we don't intend to be, but it feels like the person we were overseas is different than the person we are if we're living like in the US or Canada, whatever our passport country is. So for you, when you started writing your story, telling your story, all of that, did it help you merge kind of back together in a way, or do you still find there's some disconnect?
Yeah, somewhat. And what you just described is so real that I'm heading to Europe next week. And I know that when I get off that plane, pieces of French Michelle are going to kind of like descend over me like a cloak again. And I'm going to be more that person. But there's a real utilitarian piece to that actually is a testament to our adaptability. So we recognize contexts and learn that who I am here and the things I say and the subjects I focus on in this one context needs to be different in this context. And it's actually our power of adaptation that makes some of us do that. The problem is it needs to be a Venn diagram. So there needs to be some crossover between my Frenchness and my Americanness in the middle. If you see me, I'm speaking very French with my hands flying around. But there has to be that middle, that overlap of the two circles so that we don't drift away from the other extreme of our cultural continuum, right? So I think it's very good for us to be able to mostly belong in each place where we are, but the key word there is mostly belong, because if we end up completely being that person, then we lose track of all these other aspects of our lives that have shaped us and enriched us in a way that we can then pay forward to the society, the people, the contexts that we enter into now. So that's my caveat about that. It's a really good practice to be able to adapt to various places. And it is our superpower. We are so good at that. But as long as we don't lose connection with those other pieces of ourselves. And to answer your question, speaking of going off on rabbit trails, to answer your question, writing has, I don't think in the way you said it, but it has helped me to communicate other parts of the world with people who might not ever have experienced them. So my novels are, I call them destination novels. They take place in places that have really impacted me strongly, in places that hum in my bones. And so I want people to be able to enter. One book happens around the Black Forest. So I want people to be able to enter into what it feels like to live in a small village in Germany, or to become missionaries to Kathmandu, Nepal, coming out of, Indiana, and the differences, the clashes that happen in those contexts. So, and one of them happens in my castle, one of my castle. Now I'm the owner of the castle. One of the books happens there as well, because I felt like I knew every crevice of that castle and I wanted to be able to express it to people in an entertaining way. And one of my favorite things is probably a year ago, somebody got to go to La Morlaix, France, where this castle is, and it's now the town hall where the mayor and those offices are. And this person walked into the castle and she said, I felt like I'd been there before, because right down to the design of the tile on the floor and the staircase, which has a big role in the novel. It felt like they had visited these places. So the TCK in me loves introducing people to places they might never go to, like Paris. The space between words starts with the terrorist attack in Paris, but it begins before that, so I can walk down the street of Paris and introduce them to the sights and the sounds and the savors of the pastries that are so endemic to places. So that's how it feeds my TCK soul.
Okay. That's just so interesting. I love it. Um, What advice would you give an MK who wants to start writing their own story or sharing their testimony, but maybe just doesn't have any idea where to start?
Yeah.
What advice would you give them?
Yeah, and it's hard to give one answer to that because everybody is so different.
It's true.
There are some MKs whose personalities make it possible for them to. Let's go back to the cocktail party illustration. Who can be at a cocktail party and start talking about their lives, and they make it so interesting and compelling that it's easy for them. That's just the way they're built, and they're good at it. And there are other MKs who will struggle. With even opening the conversation about something that feels very personal and intimate to them. So each case is going to be different. For those who struggle with speaking of the person they used to be in other spheres on other planets, I would encourage them to find the means that is most comfortable to them, not the one that is comfortable, because there might not be one that 100% is. For some of them, it's going to be posting pictures on social media and interacting with people about the pictures, or even posting a picture and relating it to a memory of theirs from childhood. For others, it's going to be finding, maybe on social media, maybe in other social networks, other people who have lived in that part of the world who get together for coffee or for dinner once a month, and they get to tell each other stories. So it's a welcoming place for their stories to be told, because that's why they're getting together. For a lot of MKs, I encourage them to start with their closest friends, and some MKs are engaged or married to people who have never visited their other parts of the world. And I believe, I see hands, and I believe that that spouse or future spouse doesn't really know you until he or she has heard about who you were in those previous lives and other places. Just a few years ago, a friend who grew up with me in La Morlaix, in my castle, came to France with her husband, and he had never been to France with her before. And she said that he got off the airplane in Paris, saw the sea of people wearing black, and went, "Oh, well, this is beginning to make sense, because that is our national color, is black." And I've heard this story from so many people, as they start to speak their language and interact with the locals, they see different traits coming out of this person that they thought they knew 100% inside and out. The way we speak, the cadence of our words, the animation of our words is going to vary from culture to culture. The way we greet strangers and friends, the way we leave a room is going to be different than what they're used to. If I'm in France and I'm leaving a room, I have to go around that room and say goodbye to every single person, because that's the right thing to do. If I'm in the States, I'm going to very casually say, "Hey, bye everybody," one wave, and I'm out the door, right? So for people who are dating or engaged or married, I highly recommend that they pull out the old picture albums, if that's a comfortable place to start, and start walking through their life memories, and not talking just about, "This is why I was here, this is what we were doing," but "This is what I remember. This is what marked me in that moment." Most of mine have to do with pastry, I'm not going to lie, but there are these nuances that we need to try to communicate to people who love us, because they are ingrained in us. The sights, the sounds, the customs, the festivals and festivities, the way people drive, the way people treat their pets. I mean, so many small things, relatively speaking, that play out in our lives, even when we've left that world and entered another and found our place there.
Thank you. And my final question for you,
Mhm.
do you have a favorite book that you've written?
Oh my goodness. Do I have a favorite child, is what you're asking me? Um, let me think. The space between words is my before last one. It's the one that deals, all of my books are dual timelines. So there's a modern day timeline and a historic timeline that intersect at some point. That one has the post terrorist attack in Paris storyline, a woman who survives that, who was in the room when the attack happened. And it also has a lot of Huguenot history in it. And the Huguenot history, for anybody in the evangelical world, I think it's important for us to understand where our roots are, going all the the way back to the 16th and 17th century, and the persecution, the true persecution that those people lived under, not the hangnail kind of persecution that we claim today. So I love that book for that duality of modern day horrors that are happening and remembering the horrors that happened back then, and that the God the Huguenots served is the same God that we know and serve today, and that I think there are lessons to be learned in tracing that line, and in learning from our ancestors who went through so much more than we can imagine. So I think that's at the top. The one about the castle, of course, because my castle, and it's World War II as well as modern day. The one about Germany, because I love Germany, and because it's got a great love story. That's the beauty of being a writer, is that I get to write the men that I would want to meet and date. So all the men are great in my novels. The last one, however, tells the story of a survivor of breast cancer. And I think that we've gotten better at speaking openly about breast cancer. You can say the B word without stumbling over it. But I don't think people yet understand what it feels like to be the cancer survivor, to be the person who went through it, who had the surgeries, who had the reconstruction, who tried to keep relationships together while going through the arduous task of surviving. So I really wanted to highlight that, as well as a World War II piece in that book that starts on D-Day in Normandy, an American paratrooper who falls off target and gets taken in by two sisters in a small castle. So that one is dear to my heart because of the cancer thing. I've had cancer 3 times now, most recently 5 years ago. And again, legacy. I want my story in some form to be heard so that it can have an impact on people other than me, and it doesn't go to the grave with me whenever that is. So that's a very convoluted answer that essentially says, no, I don't have a favorite child.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing with us. Now we can unmute